Mason pulled Ivy into his arms, her body pressed against his, clearly feeling each other's every line. His hands moved gently on her body, slowly but firmly, as if wanting to engrave every moment of intimacy into her mind. Their breaths intertwined, blending in the warm atmosphere of the small room. Ivy trembled slightly when feeling Mason's caress. She closed her eyes to let herself be completely immersed in the intense emotions that were surging. Mason's fingers slid across her bare shoulders, his gestures both gentle and full of love. Welcome to our channel. If you love engaging and emotional love stories, then come to our channel. Here we will bring you stories full of surprises, touching and engaging. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any interesting stories. In today's video, we would like to present to you a story called Living with Sister-in-Law, narrated by Jane. Please watch along. Ivy is now a 27-year-old widow, struggling to cope with the loss of her husband. Nathan, her beloved husband, passed away from cancer, leaving Ivy with 2 young children, Anne and Liam. She has to struggle to be both a father and a mother. Every day she wakes up early, prepares breakfast, takes the children to their grandparents' house, and then rushes to work. Ivy's whole life revolves around work and taking care of her children, leaving no space for herself. One afternoon, while Ivy was working, she received a phone call from her mother-in-law, Victoria. Her voice sounded more tired than usual. "Ivy, Mason and I are moving in with you. I have no choice. Mason owes money again. I have to sell the house to pay him back." Ivy was speechless, her heart heavy. She knew Mason, her husband's younger brother, was irresponsible. Since he was young, he was famous for his playful lifestyle and had accumulated debts due to gambling. Now that they had lost their home, their mother-in-law and Mason had nowhere to go, so they would move into Ivy's house. "Yes, Mom, you and Mason can come back here and live with me," Ivy said, unable to hide her anxiety. When Mason and Mrs. Victoria moved in, Ivy had to rearrange her life. The small house suddenly became more cramped, and Mason's presence made her feel uncomfortable. Mason, at the age of 24, was still the same as ever, a loafer without a stable job. He hung out with his friends all day and came home late at night, usually after midnight. One night, Ivy tried to talk to her mother-in-law about Mason's situation. "Mom, Mason can't keep being like this. Why don't you advise him to get married? Once he has a wife and children, he will change." Ivy sighed, looking at Mrs. Victoria, expecting some kind of reaction. Mrs. Victoria was equally heavy. "I thought about that too, but who would dare to marry him? He only knows how to make me suffer. I don't know what to do anymore." Ivy was silent, clearly feeling the sadness that was covering both of them. She missed Nathan. He was always a responsible man who loved his family, but now Nathan was gone, leaving her alone with the burden of her husband's family. In the following months, the relationship between Mason and Ivy began to become more complicated. Every little moment, whether intentional or not, carried an irresistible attraction that both of them could not deny. Mason, with his strong and decisive nature, found it increasingly difficult to control his emotions when he was near Ivy. Every gesture, every small action of Ivy seemed to stimulate his masculine instincts, making him always think of her. One afternoon, Ivy was standing in the kitchen preparing dinner, her long hair tied up high, curls in front of her forehead. She wore a light shirt and a knee-length skirt, simple clothes but showing off her slim and attractive figure. Mason walked into the kitchen to get some water, but his eyes were immediately drawn to Ivy's perfect features. "Do you need any help?" Mason spoke, his voice a little hoarse, trying to stay awake. Ivy turned to look at him, her eyes a little shy but still gentle. "No need. Rest. I can handle it." She smiled lightly. Her red lips made Mason's heart beat faster. He walked closer, standing next to her at the kitchen counter. "Let me help you." Mason resolutely took the knife and started chopping vegetables, although his eyes never left Ivy. The light scent from her body wafted past, making his heart flutter. Ivy smiled slightly, but seemed a little embarrassed. "You're so diligent today. You don't usually do that," she teased, her voice as gentle as a breeze. Mason smiled, but his smile carried a hint of ambiguity. "Maybe it's because I'm by your side today that you want to work harder." Mason's half-joking, half-serious remark made Ivy blush slightly, but she quickly turned away, not letting Mason see the turmoil in her heart. The two continued to cook in that stuffy space, with only the sound of knives and chopping boards and their light breathing. The accidental touches, when Mason handed ingredients to Ivy or when she turned around and bumped into him, were like small sparks but strong enough to ignite the tension between them. That night, Victoria sat down to eat with the two children, not paying much attention to Mason's eyes that always followed Ivy. Every time Ivy picked up food, her slender hands moved rhythmically. Victoria's sitting posture was graceful. The dim light shone on her smooth white skin, making Mason unable to look away. That night, after cleaning up, Mrs. Victoria put the two children to bed, leaving Mason and Ivy downstairs. The room suddenly became quiet. Only the ticking of the clock and the dim light from the night light. Ivy was sitting on the sofa, holding a book in her hand, but seemed unable to focus on the content. She felt Mason's eyes from across from her, hot and full of desire. Mason sat on the opposite chair, his eyes never leaving Ivy. He was too familiar with this feeling like his whole body was being drawn towards her, as if with just a small movement he would break all the rules and boundaries. The silence in the room only increased the tension between them. Mason knew the tension in the house, especially between him and Ivy, was getting out of hand. He took a deep breath and spoke, breaking the tense atmosphere. "Are you okay? I've noticed you're tired lately. You don't look well," Mason asked, his voice gentle but filled with genuine concern. Ivy looked up at Mason, her eyes slightly confused but trying to appear calm. She didn't want this conversation to drag on any longer than necessary. "I'm fine. I've just been busy lately. I'm probably a little stressed." She smiled slightly, but that smile couldn't hide the turmoil in her heart. Mason nodded slightly, but his eyes still did not leave Ivy. "If you need anything, just tell me. We are family. Don't be shy." "Yeah, I know, don't worry. Everything is fine." Ivy stood up, intending to end the conversation by cleaning up the books on the table, but Mason remained seated, his eyes following her every move. In the dim room, with only the faint light from the table lamp, the space seemed more intimate than ever. Both of them felt it, but no one said anything. Ivy felt her heart beat faster than usual when standing near Mason, and she could not deny that his eyes made her feel something inexplicable. Mason stood up and walked closer to Ivy, but this time he kept his distance. "You go to sleep. It's late. I'm going back to my room too," Mason said. His voice was warm, but there was a clear restraint in it. Ivy looked up at him, trying to smile to ease the tension in her heart. "Yeah, you go to bed early too. I'll clean up and come up right away," she replied, but deep down she knew that the uncomfortable feeling in her heart wouldn't go away that easily. Mason walked out of the room, but before leaving he turned back to look at Ivy one last time. That gaze was deep, carrying an unspoken word, as if he wanted to say something but couldn't say it. The two stood there for a few seconds before Mason nodded slightly and left towards his room. Mason returned to his room, closed the door, and threw himself on the bed. But no matter how hard he tried to close his eyes, he couldn't stop thinking about Ivy. The image of her sitting in front of him, her slim figure in a shirt, and her gentle but thoughtful eyes kept swirling in his head. He told himself that he shouldn't let this go any further. Ivy was his sister-in-law, who had been his brother's wife. But that feeling, the warmth of being near her, the attraction she brought, everything made his reason waver. He couldn't stop thinking about her, about the way she smiled, the way she avoided his eyes whenever she felt awkward. Mason turned over, looking up at the ceiling, trying to clear his confused thoughts. "I can't do this," he told himself. But then Ivy's image appeared again, her gentle smile, her worried eyes every time she observed him. Mason's emotions were in turmoil, not knowing whether to move forward or stop. Mason lay awake all night, his emotions raging inside him, unable to sleep. He knew that if things continued like this, one day things would spiral out of control. Ivy was no better. She sat on the bed, looking out the window, conflicted. She knew she needed to keep her distance from Mason, but the look in his eyes, the tenderness in his every move, made her unable to stop thinking about him. That Sunday, the house became quieter when Mrs. Victoria went to a party. Ivy stayed home with Mason. The two children had been sent to their grandparents' house. Ivy was cleaning the house when Mason came out of his room. He stood still looking at Ivy for a moment. His eyes were strange. "Sister Ivy, are you off today?" Mason asked, his voice gentle but a bit probing. "Yes, you're off today. Have you eaten yet?" Ivy didn't look at Mason, trying to keep a safe distance. Mason suddenly put a 500,000 VND bill on the table. "Go to the market and buy something delicious to cook for us to eat." Ivy was surprised, but also a bit suspicious. Since Mason moved in, he had never given her money, and even more so, refused to contribute anything to the family. "You keep it and spend it? I've gone to the market," Ivy refused. But Mason insisted, his eyes determined. "No, you take it. You just cook a delicious meal for both of us." Ivy finally reluctantly took the money and prepared the meal. During lunch that day, Mason opened a beer and poured them both. "Have a drink with me to cool off," he invited, his eyes seeming expectant. Ivy shook her head. "I don't know how to drink beer. Just drink." "Just have one glass, you won't get drunk. It's been a long time since we've had the chance to sit together like this. We're family. What's there to be shy about?" Mason said, his voice gentle but carrying a bit of persuasion, as if drinking with him was the most natural thing. Ivy hesitated for a moment and finally agreed. "Just one glass. I really can't drink much." She took the beer Mason handed her, poured it into a glass and took a small sip. The bitter taste of beer filled her mouth. Ivy wasn't used to drinking, but today she wanted to ease the underlying tension that existed between them. While Ivy drank slowly, Mason quickly finished a can and poured a second. The alcohol began to take hold of him. Mason's eyes became blurry, his face flushed, but his eyes still followed Ivy with special attention. "Ivy," Mason suddenly called, his voice hoarse than usual. "I've wanted to tell you something for a long time. I've wanted to say it, but haven't had the chance." Ivy looked up at Mason, a little worried. "What's wrong, Mason?" "You've had too much to drink. Leave it there and rest. Eat to sober up." But Mason didn't answer right away. Instead, he put the beer can on the table and slowly approached Ivy. He sat down next to her on the sofa in the living room, his dark eyes fixed on her, as if he wanted to understand every thought deep in her heart. "Do you know? Ever since my brother died, I haven't been able to stop thinking about you. You're the strongest woman I've ever met, but I know you're lonely too, right?" Ivy felt her heart beat faster. She began to feel uncomfortable with the way Mason looked at her, and the words he just said made her even more confused. "Mason, what are you talking about? We are sisters. I'm not alone. I have 2 kids." Ivy stood up confused, about to leave the chair. To end this awkward conversation, Mason suddenly grabbed her hand and pulled her back. The strength from his hand startled her. "Don't run away anymore. We can't deny this forever. You can feel it too, right?" Ivy jerked her hand away, her eyes filled with determination. "I'm drunk, Mason. I don't know what I'm saying. We can't do this. I'm his brother. You're my sister-in-law. This isn't right." But Mason didn't let her finish her sentence. He stepped closer, his hand gently but firmly placed on Ivy's shoulder. His eyes looked straight into hers, as if wanting to take over her mind. "I don't understand, Ivy. I can't stop thinking about you. We've been so close all this time, I can't stand it when you keep avoiding me like this." Before Ivy could react, Mason leaned down and placed a light kiss on her neck, where her silky hair had just covered. The warm feeling from his lips transmitted to her skin made Ivy's body freeze. She was startled, feeling like an electric current running through her body. Mason let her go. "Mason, what are you doing?" Ivy said, her voice lost in fear and anxiety. "We can't do this. I'm drunk. Wake up." But Mason didn't listen. His breathing was rapid. He deepened the kiss. His hands moved along the S-curve, pulling her closer. "You don't need to be afraid. I won't hurt you. I just want to love you, Ivy, because you deserve to be loved." Ivy began to panic. She pushed Mason away, but her strength was not enough to resist his strength. She struggled, feeling like she was trapped in a vortex of emotions that she couldn't control. Mason's breathing became hotter and hotter. His hands began to slide down. His desire became more obvious than ever. "Mason, enough." "Stop!" Ivy screamed, pushing him away with all her strength. Finally, she stepped back, her eyes filled with anger and fear. "You can't do this to me. I don't want to. Do you understand?" Mason paused, his eyes filled with anger and confusion. He stood there staring at Ivy, but this time he didn't move closer. The room fell silent, save for the sound of their hurried breathing. Ivy stepped back, trying to steady her breathing. "We can't go on like this, Mason. This is wrong. You have to understand that." Mason fell silent and turned to walk out the door, but before he left, he turned back, his eyes still burning with desire. "You can't avoid it forever, because sooner or later we'll have to face this." Ivy stood there watching Mason's back disappear behind the door, her heart filled with confusion and fear. She knew that things had gone too far, and if she didn't stop now, she and Mason would never be able to go back to how they were before. But she couldn't deny that deep inside she felt a wavering feeling, a feeling she had never experienced with anyone. Ivy shook her head, tears welling up in her eyes. "This can't be. Uncle, don't say any more, or I'll never see you again." She ran into the room, slammed the door shut, and leaned against the door, her whole body trembling. Mason's words haunted Ivy, making her unable to calm down. How could something like this happen? Since that night, Ivy tried to keep her distance from Mason, but his presence in her daily life became more and more burdensome. He began to help her more, from picking up and dropping off the children, teaching them, to small things like cleaning the house. However, Ivy could not forget what Mason had said. Every time he came near, she felt the tension increase. Mason kept showing his concern. When eating, he picked up food for Victoria and then picked up food for Ivy, his eyes never leaving her. Ivy felt even more suffocated, but in front of her mother-in-law, she could only smile, trying to act normal. "Mason is really good these days, isn't he? He knows how to cook and take care of the family now. I'm so happy." Victoria smiled happily. Ivy forced a smile, her heart filled with anxiety. She understood that her mother-in-law did not know what was going on between her and Mason, but that did not ease the anxiety in her heart. Every day when Mason was near, she felt trapped in a tangled mess of emotions, unable to escape. Then one night when the whole family had fallen asleep, Ivy woke up with a start when she felt someone on top of her. She felt hot breath and strong hands holding her tightly. In the darkness, she recognized Mason. Ivy's heart pounded, her whole body was numb. "Mason, what are you doing?" Ivy tried to scream, but her voice was just a gasp. Mason did not answer, just silently kissed her neck. His hands explored Ivy's fertile land. In that moment, Ivy no longer had the strength to resist. She was caught up in the dream, letting everything happen. And so Mason, with his power, completely possessed Ivy. But that was not enough to satisfy Mason. Mason wanted Ivy to fall into his arms to be satisfied. After that night, Ivy found herself in a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. She couldn't forgive herself for not being able to resist Mason's temptation, but she also couldn't deny that she had been drawn into this ambiguous relationship. Every time she saw Mason, a part of her felt disgusted for betraying her husband, but on the other hand, she couldn't deny the closeness and warmth that Mason brought, things she had been missing since Nathan's death. In the days that followed, Mason remained as caring and attentive as before, but never mentioned what had happened between them. This made Ivy both relieved and worried. She tried to keep her distance, but Mason didn't seem to let go. He spent more and more time at home, helping with housework and taking care of the 2 children, making Ivy unable to help but feel pressured. Every time she sat down to eat with her family, Ivy felt suffocated when Mason kept staring at her. Sometimes he deliberately touched her hand when he brought her food. A feeling of guilt arose when Mrs. Victoria was still cheerful, completely unaware of what was going on. Mrs. Victoria often teased Ivy about Mason's change. "You see, since coming here, Mason has changed a lot. He knows how to take care of the family. I think I'm about to have a new daughter-in-law." Ivy smiled awkwardly, not daring to respond. She knew Mason's feelings, and she herself began to feel the change in herself. Mason was no longer the irresponsible brother-in-law like before, but now his presence in her life made everything chaotic. One night when the whole family was fast asleep, Ivy was still lying on the bed. She couldn't stop thinking about everything that had happened between her and Mason. Every time she thought about the kiss, the passionate touches, her heart was filled with torment, but what confused her the most was her own hidden expectation. She didn't want it, but couldn't stop the feeling of emptiness every time Mason wasn't around. Suddenly, the door to the room creaked slightly. Ivy startled and turned her head to see Mason quietly walking in, his eyes looking at her lovingly. "What are you doing here?" Ivy whispered, her heart beating wildly. "Are you asleep yet?" Mason asked, sitting down next to her bed. "I can't stop thinking about you." Ivy turned her face away, trying to avoid Mason's gaze. "We shouldn't be like this. This is wrong. Do you understand?" Mason shook his head and moved closer. "No, I don't think so. Brother Nathan is gone. You don't have to live alone like this forever. I want to be with you, take care of you and the children." "But you are my sister-in-law. We can't." Ivy choked. Tears began to flow down her cheeks. "If people know about this, what will they think? What will Mom think?" Mason gently wiped her tears, his voice becoming more serious. "I don't care what others think. I just need to know that I love you and I want you to be happy." The warmth from Mason's hand spread throughout Ivy's body. She felt the sincerity in his words, but at the same time her mind kept reminding her that this was wrong. "I'm sorry, Mason, I can't," Ivy choked, pushed him away and turned her back. Mason stood still for a long time, his eyes filled with pity as he looked at Ivy. "Don't worry, I won't force you into anything, but I'll wait until you're ready," Mason said, then quietly left the room, leaving Ivy in turmoil. She knew things had gone too far, but the feelings and emptiness inside her were too great for her to pull away. One evening, when Mrs. Victoria took the two children to the neighbour's house to play, the house became strangely quiet. Ivy and Mason were home, both cleaning the kitchen. The air between them seemed to freeze, tense and filled with hidden anticipation. Mason stepped closer to Ivy, his breath fanning her back, making her feel every breath of air carrying desire. Ivy did not turn around. She tried to continue wiping the table as if she did not notice, but the tension in her body said it all. "Ivy," Mason whispered, his voice low and seductive, making her shiver. He reached out to touch Ivy's shoulder, gently stroking down her back, each movement burning both her mind and body. She stood still without protest, only closing her eyes when she felt his warmth filling her back. "You know I've been waiting for this for a long time, right?" Mason whispered into Ivy's ear, his voice full of love, sensuality, but also extremely strong. Ivy didn't answer. Her lips trembled, her mind struggled, but her body betrayed her. Mason turned her around, his eyes intense, eyes that had long since lost her way. And then, as if drawn by an invisible force, Ivy closed her eyes, allowing Mason to kiss her lips. Mason's kiss was gentle but also full of desire. Each of his touches was like a fire that burned Ivy's last bit of reason. She surrendered. She couldn't fight anymore. They were both caught in each other's arms, immersed in an unstoppable storm of emotions. Mason picked Ivy up, carried her into the bedroom, where they left behind all that was right or wrong. In that moment, they were no longer sister-in-law and sister-in-law, but just two people immersed in desire. Nothing could stop them. In the quiet space of the bedroom, the dim light from the table lamp covered Mason and Ivy's shoulders. The sound of the wind outside blew gently through the open window, creating a soft Victoria sound, as if to further enhance the closeness between the two. Ivy lay on her side on the bed, her eyes shining with gentleness and a bit of shyness, while Mason sat next to her, his eyes intently looking at her. He gently stroked Ivy's soft hair and slowly leaned down to place a warm kiss on her forehead. The light scent from Ivy's body mixed with the air, making the whole room filled with a sense of peace and romance. Mason touched Ivy's small hand, pulling her closer to him. She didn't say anything, just looked at him with trusting eyes and quietly put her arms around his neck. They exchanged meaningful glances without words. They could feel the understanding between their hearts. Mason's hand gently slid across Ivy's smooth skin, each touch like a sweet whisper. He felt her heartbeat quicken, her breathing become deeper and heavier. In the absolute silence, only the sound of breathing and passionate emotions remained. At that moment, time seemed to stop. Mason leaned down, gently placing his lips on Ivy's soft lips. The kiss was gentle at first, like a gentle greeting, but gradually became deeper and more intense as emotions arose. Ivy felt every thoughtful gesture of Mason. Her heart seemed to blend with his heartbeat. Their lips blended together in an indescribable harmony, as if all the distance between them had been completely erased. Mason pulled Ivy into his arms, her body pressed against his, clearly feeling each other's features. His hands moved gently on her body, slowly but firmly, as if wanting to engrave this intimate moment into her mind. Their breaths intertwined, blending in the warm atmosphere of the small room. Ivy trembled slightly when she felt Mason's caress. She closed her eyes to completely immerse herself in the intense emotions that were surging. Mason's fingers slid across her bare shoulders. His every gesture was both gentle and full of love. Both were immersed in an intimate moment that no words could describe the feelings they had for each other. Every touch, every caress, was an expression of love and desire. The space seemed to shrink, leaving only the two of them and the passionate emotions that filled that moment. Ivy clearly felt the strong connection between the two souls, not just physical closeness, but also a deep emotional bond. The two of them made love for more than 2 hours and finally finished. They truly experienced a magical moment of a dream, making them feel like they were lost in a fairyland. When they finished, they both hugged each other and fell asleep without realizing it. In the days that followed, Ivy could not deny that her relationship with Mason had completely changed. They no longer kept their distance, but instead became closer and closer. Whenever he had the chance, Mason always found a way to be near her, to touch her, and Ivy seemed unable to refuse. For the first time in years, Ivy felt loved, cared for intensely. Mason took care of her, pampered her in a way that Nathan, her former husband, had never done. Guilt always lurked in Ivy's mind, but every time Mason got close, all reason disappeared. She knew she was deeply involved in this relationship, but she could not stop. Every night after Victoria and the children had gone to bed, Ivy and Mason would secretly meet each other, giving each other lustful gestures. The tension between them turned into moments of ecstasy and ups and downs, making Ivy increasingly unable to stop, even though she knew that if everything was discovered, the consequences would be very serious. But they couldn't stop. One day, when Mrs. Victoria unexpectedly returned home early, she found Mason and Ivy in a very intimate situation. She stood rooted to the door, unable to believe what she saw, her eyes gradually turning cold, disappointment and pain evident. "What are you doing?" Mrs. Victoria asked in a choked voice, tears streaming from her old eyes. Ivy was stunned, feeling as if the ground beneath her feet had collapsed. Everything suddenly stopped. There was nowhere to hide. The truth was exposed. She looked straight into her mother-in-law's eyes. Her heart felt like it was being squeezed. Guilt welled up in her, but it was too late now. "I'm sorry, Mum," Ivy whispered, tears streaming down her cheeks. Mason stepped forward to explain, but Victoria raised her hand to stop him. "There's no need to say anything. I didn't expect you two to do this behind Nathan's back. Nathan's gone, but you still can't keep your dignity." Ivy couldn't say anything more. She knew that any excuses were meaningless now. Victoria turned away, tears streaming down her face. "I have nothing more to say to you two. Don't ever think that this can be forgiven." Victoria left the house, leaving Mason and Ivy in silence and despair. They were in too deep, and there was no way back now. In the days that followed, the house became colder than ever. Victoria moved to live with relatives and no longer contacted Ivy or Mason. Both knew that they had destroyed not only their relationship, but also the family they once had. Mason tried to stay by Ivy's side, but she gradually realized that this relationship only brought pain and guilt. Every time Ivy looked into Mason's eyes, she couldn't help but think of Nathan, the husband she once loved, and the feeling of guilt grew in her heart. Finally, Ivy decided to leave Mason. She couldn't continue living in this wrong relationship. Mason tried to hold on, but Ivy knew that if they continued, they would never escape the torment of their conscience. Ivy packed her things, took her 2 children and left the house, leaving Mason alone in regret and pain. She knew that this was the right thing to do, no matter how painful it was. Ivy and her 2 children moved to another city and started a new life. Although she had escaped the wrong relationship with Mason, the wounds in her heart were not easy to heal. She lived with the feeling of guilt as an atonement for her mistakes. As for Mason, he was left to face loneliness and regret. He knew that he had lost everything: his mother, his brother, and the woman he loved. The wrong relationship had ruined everything, and now he was left with only emptiness. Both of them, although in 2 different places, still carried painful memories of the relationship that should not have been, and that was the price they had to pay for the mistakes that could not be corrected. Our story today will stop here. Thank you for taking the time to watch the entire video. Hopefully, the details and emotions in the story have brought you interesting and meaningful moments. If you like this video, don't forget to like, share, and leave a comment below the video to let me know your opinion. And don't forget to click the subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any stories in the future. Each of your subscribe buttons and a like will be the motivation to help Jane and the program production team have the motivation to create more attractive videos. And now, see you in the next videos. Wish you a great day